The hero's journey is overdone, but storytellers can liven up their storytelling with this historic method of framing their story. The audience craves a familiar pattern, and this alternative method has a proven biology of story with a fresh new approach to folklore that almost no one is using. Stay tuned to learn all about the epic laws. Welcome to The Whistle. I'm your host, Jen Whitfield. You have heard all about the hero's journey. Since the 1980s, the hero's journey that was originally developed by Joseph Campbell has become the format most writers turn to, and very few people actually understand how that happened. But I'm going to reveal why Disney made it the authority on storytelling. And I'm going to get into the limitations of our understanding of the hero's journey, like it's weird and Freudian and missing a female perspective. And it is lacking the biology of folktales, such as the laws of three, the laws of two, the law of opening, the law of closing. And I think it's also become a little distorted and misunderstood from how it was originally created. And finally, the new but old perspective. Danish folklorist Axel Ulrich spent his life studying the biology of folktales. What he created was a completely different, more natural way that stories organize themselves that he titled the epic laws, which until recently was hidden away and forgotten. He is regarded as one of the greatest authorities on storytelling and myth, and the epic laws are presented here in their entirety. So when did this one storytelling model take over everything and become the dominant form of storytelling? Well, that happened in the mid-1980s when a junior executive at Disney wrote an executive summary for other executives to understand the much more complex hero's journey that was a much longer book written by Joseph Campbell called A Hero with a Thousand Faces. So you've probably heard of it, or at least what you think you know, because there's a lot of differences between this executive summary memo that was circulated and the actual original version. So if you've ever taken a writing class or a literary class, it's probably been covered. But Joseph Campbell was actually an occultist who studied myth, and it was after George Lucas attributed the study, or the successive Star Wars, to The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. That was when a Disney executive kind of pirated the idea, and then it started to spread like wildfire. But to this day, most people don't actually know the difference between that executive summary and the original. So Hollywood was looking for this surefire method of success, and interestingly, the same executive, Christopher Vogler, he was afraid that his model would get overused. And as a result, I think he was right. We have stopped studying myth or trying to find any other model. And I think that can be limiting, and I think that's why we need to look to some of the really old folklorists and narrative specialists who were developing a biology of myth. So what are the limitations of the hero's journey? So we have completely neglected one of the most fascinating wells of storytelling, and that is the Nordic tales like Thor, which is actually very rich and mostly undiscovered in the English world. So writers have these models that were mostly invented by Hollywood, and we're forcing stories into these kind of worn out models. It doesn't really work for women. It's a little too Freudian, it digs around in the subconscious, and it's written from a very singular point of view that's been overly simplified. But if we look at the actual biology of folk tales, which previously has been studied, it was limited to European folk tales, and it doesn't force Eastern or indigenous stories into the same limiting framework, like the law of repetition or the law of open and close. And if European stories follow patterns not mentioned in the hero's journey, who actually studied them? So long before Joseph Campbell ever wrote the hero's journey, other scholars were doing a deep investigation into the science behind folktales, which they called the biology of stories, the biology of folktales. So they were looking for this deeper unifying structure, because a lot of folklorists agree there is a familiarity. It feels like coming home to these stories when you see the same patterns or the same themes repeated when these stories are very similar. But some of the best theorists were actually unrecognized because their work just wasn't translated into English. So you get something like Joseph Campbell that becomes very dominant, and then you're missing one of the greats, like Axel Ulrich, who wrote the epic laws. The epic laws were created by Danish folklorist and university professor Axel Ulrich. So like Campbell, he was attempting to find a unity of folklore, but unlike Campbell, he limited his search to European folktales. It was published originally from lectures that he gave in Copenhagen and in Berlin around 1908. So Axel Ulrich outlines the epic laws, and then after his death in 1917, his student published his teachings in a book titled The Epic Laws in 1921. Now, if the epic laws are so great, you might be asking, why have I never heard of them? They weren't translated into English until 1965. So that's a good 15 years after The Hero's Journey was published. And not fully until 1992, when a final secret chapter was also translated. I don't know which chapter that was. So mostly Axel Ulrich's work escaped the myth and storytelling zeitgeist because very few people in the English-speaking world had ever actually read it. It's referenced a lot, but a lot of experts hadn't actually read it because it wasn't translated. It was harder to translate things. I actually found copies of his speeches and I plugged it into Google Translate. It took some time, but I was able to actually compare all of his work together, but that just wasn't something we could do. So his work has really escaped the zeitgeist. So his understanding of European folktales, especially Nordic folktales like Thor, remains one of the most superior explanations of story structure, and he identifies a series of epic laws that appear in folktales within specific categories, which he also outlines, and in addition to the laws themselves, he explains from a Darwinian perspective why some narratives are able to adapt and change with time, and why some die off, which is especially relevant right now when we're in an era of intellectual property and rights, and retelling the same stories in reboots and sequels with unpredictable success. Sometimes rebooting IP is a smash hit, and sometimes it is a box office bomb, and I think we need a framework to understand why some of those stories work to get a reboot and some just don't. And lastly, he explains how the setting contributes to the narrative's relevance and importance. So here are the epic laws, along with their categories, adaptations, and setting laws in their entirety from all of his combined printed teachings. So categories of stories. Ulrich has two categories of story, of narrative, lay and saga, with further subcategories. Lay narratives are simple plots. Sagas are of considerable length with complex plot, and they can take on two forms, heroic and tales or legends. So heroic sagas are short historical legend, which can be further subdivided into historical and non-historical. And tales can be further subdivided into origin or anecdote, which can also be religious legends, but they don't have to be. So when Ulrich said if there is such a thing as biology of story, as in if there is a science that can define their similarity, he is speaking only of European legends and folk tales told within a distinct simplicity. So the unifying idea over all the epic laws is unity of plot. To achieve unity, stories must work toward a single strandedness of plot, which is a law in itself. The plot constraints have to make it hard to achieve. That's the most important part, and it falls under the epic laws. So all the epic laws go back to the unity of plot that make it hard to achieve the story, the endgame. Only features necessary for action are included. So Ulrich says there is a general law. Every characteristic must be expressed in action, otherwise it is nothing. Each scene must tell a whole story in its totality. It cannot consist of 3 separate side quests overlapping with the unity of plot. Folk tales progress toward a final story in successive events. It doesn't zig and zag through past and present. That is something modern stories can do if you have a more complex form of storytelling like a novel. A characteristic unique to folk tales, and that can be broken. The law of opening. In the beginning, one moves from the individual to the multiple, from calm to excitement, from the everyday to the unusual. Stories begin with a sense of calmness before the action rises, instead of beginning abruptly, immersed immediately in the action, although I would argue in some modern storytelling a lot of thrillers begin exactly that way, and then go back. Many publishers will insist on this still. They want to see calm before you throw people in. Ironically, everyone thinks Campbell is the authority on storytelling, but this is actually not a stage in his original book. In the memo executive summary that was distributed by Disney, one of their executives rather, it is listed as a stage where we meet the hero in his familiar world, which is that same idea that we need to have a sense of calm. That actually wasn't written by Joseph Campbell. That was an add-on because he watched all these stories and he noticed that was a common element. So that one has sustained, where we want to meet the character in his or her own world. We want to have a sense of calm before everything gets crazy. It's also mentioned in other works like Sid Field's 3-act structure, and Blake Snyder's Save the Cat. So a story begins with a starting point, followed up by the law of closing. So according to Ulrich, the story ends after a decisive event, but not so suddenly that it is startling. So it's like a wave. It goes up and it goes down. Things return to calm and disappear gradually from the main character and the main episode to conclude the later fate of the main character into a lasting, lingering, resting state. The ending establishes the influence and importance that the protagonist has over the fate of other characters, such as punishments or rewards, and visible memories of the event. So an example in the French story, after Roland's last breath, a hero's story, the story follows with falling asleep on the sword's hilt, the hero's burial, the revenge, the beloved dying of grief, and execution of the traitor. And the longer the tale, the longer the resolution. Like in Lord of the Rings, you've sat through like 13 hours of 3 movies. It takes time to get everybody's final resolution out. They don't just have that big final ending and then poof, it's over. There's a lot of little resolution, and I personally like that. There are exceptions in Spanish folk romance. And I like that Ulrich mentions the exceptions to these laws. So that's saying he really understood them, he really studied them, and he's not saying everything is forced into these ideas. He's saying these ideas generally appeared in old folk tales, but there are exceptions. So in a Spanish folk romance, the prisoner sits waiting for his death, and the song ends when a liberating princess opens the door. And in modern poetry, there can be new ways of ending a story. So the law of concentration can also be translated to the law of centralization. The plot concentrates on one leading character who dictates the succession of events through his or her actions. And a story can feature 2 main characters, but one will usually take over the plot. That is still true today. It's hard to have a true, It's hard to have a true ensemble cast. Usually one character will end up taking over the story. In the simplicity of folk tales, there are very few characters or forces that even occur in the same story. So when the hero and monster are fighting, for example, the princess is only faintly visible. A supernatural helper is not present for a decisive event, but beforehand. The law of contrast. When 2 characters or 2 actions appear at the same time, the narrative will establish a contrast between them, good and evil, rich and poor, big and small, old and young. The adversary is different and opposite from the protagonist, and that idea remains still. Creating a character who is worse off by contrast will automatically invoke sympathy, and the main character defines that contrast. This is very present in a lot of Dickens stories, like Scrooge is very rich, which automatically creates sympathy for Tiny Tim. So in other words, the protagonist sets the norm and everyone else revolves around him or her. Any differences or similarities are exaggerated around the main character. So this is also called the law of scenic duality or the law of opposition, and sagas are polarizing events. So for example, Thor, who's not very smart, requires wise Odin or cunning Loki. Rich Peter Kramer and poor Paul Schmid literally do not know that example. A lot of the examples come from folktales in Europe that I don't know. The grieving maiden is juxtaposed by a joyful maiden. The law of twins. So he doesn't mean twins, just brothers or two that appear together. So when two characters have the same rule, one becomes weaker. When a lesser character appears, it is usually not as an individual, but as a repetition of the same character. So if it's a very minor character, it will appear in folk tales as two. So Odin has two ravens, not one raven, because one is the main character. Even in modern stories, the henchmen rarely appear alone. There's usually at least a pair of them. And complex dramas can have more than two people on the stage at the same time. He's referring only to very simple folktales. So if you have two brothers who end up becoming too different from each other, they will split off into main character and antagonist. The law of threes. From the number of acts to the unfolding of the story, successive events usually come in threes as a form of repetition. So 3 narratives have a preference in characters, objects, and successive episodes. Anything more than 3 is clustered as many, and 12 is considered a group. So as example, for 3 days in a row, the young man goes off in search of a giant. Each day he slays a giant. Or in Jack and the Beanstalk, it takes Jack 3 successive attempts that get progressively harder. Indian stories break the law of 3 since 3 is considered bad luck. Unlike Campbell, he doesn't brute force cultures into one universal idea. The law of repetition. In folktales, repetition makes stories richer, but they are limited to repetition because of their simplicity. So it is important to note modern dramas can employ other techniques. This came from Ulrich himself. They do not have to rely solely on repetition, but in folktales, without repetition, otherwise the story would be over in one scene. So repetition can be simple, but it usually increases with difficulty, which overlaps with the law of 3. So when we have 3 successive repeating events, they're increasing with difficulty. So this is similar to the law of top weight. So this is a law of precedence that applies to all accounts, not just epic tales. So the mighty god, the ruling chief, the Aesir are the ruling pantheon of gods of Asgard. The mightiest people are represented by the most powerful god. So in a story of gods, again, this is where categories matter, the 4 weight is undisputedly the strongest, and overlapping with the law of 3, the most important brother goes first. In the law of final stress, now the law of final stress says that it is the final weight, the last weight, the 8th weight, which is a nautical term, that is the most epic and the most important. Emphasis is on the last sequence. So that is why when we're talking about a story of gods, they're undisputedly the most powerful. It's heroes that are forged through trials. So the emphasis is on the last sequence, and this is imposed on the law of 3s. When the last of 3 attempts will have the most epic importance and the position on the final stress. When there are 3 brothers, the most impressive brother goes first, and he sets the initial, he is placed first as the initial stress to set the bar high for the subsequent brothers to raise the stakes. make it harder. By placing the youngest brother at the end, he has the biggest challenge to overcome and invokes sympathy for the underdog through contrast. Epic tales need contrast. Law of vividness, also referred to as the law of plasticity. So the action of the story, which usually occurs in threes, which usually increases in difficulty, creates a vivid, if not punishing and effective image. The more imaginative the action and the less based in reality, the better. Nothing happens by accident, but by intentional action. Ancient heroes are not passive characters in their own story, but active participants in their own fate. That idea persists today. Publishers want to see characters making active decisions in their own life, not just letting things happen to them. That's what makes them the main character energy. In the end, everything is brought together into unity of plot, but it is the most imaginative qualities that increase the vividness. The hero's sword is pierced by the snake. Thor holds the world serpent on the hook. Perseus holds the head of Medusa. The action creates strong imagery, but there is also a holding pattern that creates a pause, which increases its ability to imprint on memory, so these stories become the most memorable. Law of approximation. The details of the narrative will be adapted to the perspective of the narrator. So in order to understand why some stories can be adapted and why some stories die, the law of approximation helps us understand their adaptation with time. So this is important to what we're talking about next, why which stories can be retold and retooled. So pay attention to this next bit. Changes in narrative. Ulrich outlines when stories adapt to changes in the outer environment, but he describes it as dangerous to the existence of the narrative. So he's not a fan of things changing to the story. Over time, they have to adapt, but a sudden change can be dangerous. When a culture makes a paradigm shift, the narrative must adapt or die out, not the other way around. I think that is so important. We're going to get to this part next. So whatever changes can be applied to the narrative are kept in check by the clarity of the episodes and inner coherence. This goes back to this unity of plot. You can't have characters going off on side quests. They have to stick to the point. And when you start reshaping the plot, you have to make sure that everything has an inner coherence and it adheres to the actual point. So he's saying there are limitations to how much a narrative can adapt before successive scenes lose their flow and the narrative will die off. He says the beginning and end are the easiest to adapt, but it is hardest to change the events in the middle. So he outlines the reasons or causes behind adaptations to a narrative, why they have to change. So first idea, to clarify a previously blurred point in the plot, to illustrate an episode, or to bring the characters to the protagonist following the law of centralization. So I think a good example of this would be something like Rogue One. So you've told all these stories in the Star Wars saga, and now there's this one little moment in between the first three and then the prequels that's left dangling, and that has become Rogue One. It's become Andor. So there was this little blurred plot point or something that needed further illustration, and that is something when we're thinking about intellectual property, that seems to be an area that the audience seems to want redone. The second reason, the narrator reasonably chooses to shape the plot in a particular direction that brings sympathy or poetic justice. So an example is Loki starts out as the antagonist, but he actually gets a richer, deeper story throughout the Marvel series because he is looking for acceptance. The third reason, new narratives are introduced into a culture that influence the old narrative, which Ulrich considers a sudden contamination. So if we look at folk tales that get told again and again across different cultures, the question is, did that just spontaneously happen that we all told the same story, or is there a contamination from another culture imposing a new idea on a story they've heard through some kind of travel? So the princess stories will get retold. Like Cinderella exists in Brothers Grimm. She exists in Perrault's French stories of court at Louis's court. She's told in something like Little Red Cap. In Jacob's fairy tales in England. So the same princess story gets told again and again, and when we see these slight variations, that's what he calls a sudden contamination. And the fourth reason, the external world has changed and the story adapts, which Ulrich describes as a gradual but natural evolution over time. So if we go back to the princess example, in the Grimm fairy tales, Snow White is quite a violent story. But when we get to this cartoon version of Snow White that made Walt Disney so famous, it's a much gentler story. So that's a case where something has shifted, the medium has shifted, and so they've adapted aspects of the story. A lot of that actually comes from a play. It's almost identical to that play. There's a silent film that you can find free on YouTube. It's like identical to the Snow White movie. Now, when this does not work is going back to that sudden paradigm shift. Like all of a sudden we had the Me Too movement. We had this shift toward diversity and inclusion, and we wanted to include more different storytellers. And suddenly a lot of these stories just did not work. And some stories can adapt, and some of them are just going to be too difficult to adapt. So not everything that was once popular that studios own the rights to can necessarily get readapted. Setting. The physical setting describes where the events occur, but they are influenced by what Ulrich calls horizon and localization. The scenery adapts the narrator's experience following the law of approximation. The horizon refers to the perspective and limitations of the narrator in relation to the story he or she is adapting, which expands as the narrator's own horizon expands, referred to as the sphere of communication. He says stories far beyond the horizon of the narrator make the story unreliable, and he describes 4 arenas: home, inner circle, middle circle, and outer circle. So he's not saying that you're limited to home. He's actually saying the opposite. The most epic stories occur in the outer circle, like a fantasy, where the preference for the hero lies at home or the inner circle. Frequently reinforcing a past horizon will retain it to the memory of the audience, even if that horizon no longer exists. But over time, the details will become poor. So we have this theory that you have to tell stories from your own personal sphere. You have to stay close to home, and you become a more reliable narrator the closer you stick to your own. But what he's saying is that stories that occur in the fantasy realm require imagination, and those are the most epic. And I tend to agree. And I think a really good example of this is in Lord of the Rings movies. The hobbits, and this happens in the books too, the hobbits keep reinforcing the idea of the Shire. This home, this sense of comfort, is something that they love and they keep going back to. And as they move further and further, it becomes more of a distant memory and they get further away from it, but it pulls you back home. Localization. Localization occurs when a narrative is adapted, so it is consistent with the local culture. So this is an example of how fairy tales get readapted again and again. This refers to the difference between the origin of things and local legends. It is placed at the end of the story which is easier to adapt, and it is very hard to actually find the origin of stories. So folklorists have to rely on folk tales to understand where it even started, because it's very difficult to actually find the origin of things. And again, you can see the influence of Darwin. There you have it. Those are the epic laws. Generally speaking, these laws are limited to folk poetry or folk tales. And Ulrich says, and I love this, the question remains open whether the further and actual composition of the narratives may also be reduced to fixed formulas. And I think this is the argument that a lot of storytellers try to make, that Joseph Campbell's hero's journey can be adapted to any kind of storytelling, a speech, a long movie, a whole series of stories, and a short little folktale, or an entire religious story. And this theory says that question remains open. Other folklorists do not believe that we have actually answered that with any certainty. So in our current understanding of the hero's journey, our belief has become that all narratives follow a fixed formula, and Ulrich is saying they're limited to categories, and we don't know that they always apply. So he's leaving the door open for experimental forms of storytelling. So even though these are the epic laws, they're not rigid rules. The door is open for modern forms of storytelling. Something like a novel can rely on exposition or descriptions. They are not limited to action the way that folktales are. Although most publishers, they will want to see a story expressed through action and not exposition. We call it showing versus telling. So I think in an era of sequels where intellectual property is so important right now, I think that Ulrich's ideas, even though they're like a century old, are really worth studying, and his emphasis on simplicity is refreshing, along with his epic laws. Also, they were written before we knew much about the psychoanalysts, or before they were so famous and imprinted on our whole psyche. There is no study in Ulrich on subconscious motivation. He uses a Darwinian approach, not a Freudian psychoanalytical approach, to focus on stories that have survived and why those stories have survived. He studies what makes a story relevant. The emphasis is on which story survived, what we can learn from that. Instead of studying the subconscious, he's studying what dies out over time and what can be adapted. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any comments or disagreements, please let me know in the comments. And stay tuned for a video next week. We're going to rank superheroes using psychology of what makes people cool and what makes people good. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next week.